Shut up, compressor. So pretty much all throughout the summer months, which, because this is Texas, means February through October, my bench is bombarded by a various cavalcade of insects. Everything from crane flies to June bugs to moths to cicadas. I've had tarantulas hanging out in my paint racks before, little tiny ass spiders that spin webs all over shit. And one of the questions is, where do they all come from? How do they all get in? Well, that is outside, and that is a big opening. And there's a light here, garage lights up there, and a lot of insects and other little creepy crawly things are attracted to lights. And a lot of the other things, the arachnids and such, are attracted to places where those things that are attracted to lights congregate. So they all come in here. Pretty much it. Okay, so let's talk about paint Nazis and color fidelity. Now, one thing that's pretty common in modeling, especially military aircraft, tanks, things like that, is a lot of obsession over getting the colors right. And for the most part, I'm in agreement with that. However, I view it the same way I view like writing and grammar, and the whole saying of know the rules and then know when to break the rules. Same thing applies. So it's one thing to know that an aircraft is a certain color. Maybe it's like European dark green or SEA dark green, same fucking color. It's one thing to know that is the color it was painted, but at the same time, you need to look at reference photos and see, okay, it's faded here, it's been retouched there, it doesn't match the planes next to it, so maybe I shouldn't use the exact color. Applies all over the place, right? You know, you look at reference photos in comparison to other reference photos, and you make a judgment call based on what you can see and what the paint in front of you is telling you, because you're not trying to recreate a fucking color chip. You're trying to recreate, if you're looking at reference photos, you're trying to recreate what you're seeing in the reference photo. And so that will require some modification, because paint, like the rest of a vehicle, is not a static thing. It changes over time. It fades, it chips, it scuffs, it gets dirty, it gets stained, it gets painted over with fresh paint. All that stuff happens, and it's important to take that into consideration when you're painting. And honestly, that is a big reason why I'm such a big fan of sort of very small micro variations in tone across the surface, because if you really look closely at pretty much any camouflaged aircraft, you're going to see that. Unless it's like a brand new thing, unless it's like, you know, F-35s that are just entering service and haven't really had the shit beat out of them yet. But you look at, I mean, even things that are clean these days, like Super Hornets and F-22s, and they're showing it. They're showing plenty of wear and tear and plenty of surface variation. Now, as a little experiment in this, let's look at a Danish F-104. What color is this? How about this one? What color is this one? Or how about this one? Now, in every paint callout that you see for one of these, it will basically say the entire fucking thing is dark green. I believe, it's been a while since I built mine, but I believe it calls out for FS 34079, which is basically European dark green / SEA dark green. They are not that anymore. Maybe at one point when they were first painted and fresh, sure. But over the life of the aircraft, it's obviously no longer the case. So, what would you do? How would you treat that? To me, this is a case of understanding the rules, understanding what technically was done, and understanding the reality of what it became over time. Now, another part of understanding the rules is understanding basically how paint was sourced and maybe how stringent the guidelines were at the time that something was produced or maintained, because it's not as though everybody is, you're not buying like a Toyota where everything is super matched in the same factory over and over and over again by fucking computers. You're talking about, hell, look at olive drab, which was basically yellow zinc chromate with black thrown in until it got to kind of like the rightish color, and then it was painted on. And you had variations not only from manufacturer to manufacturer, but from assembly plant to repair depot to field repairs. It was all over the place. Even after they standardized, it was still all over the place. I mean, you can look at modern F-16s that are supposedly painted in a nice controlled environment, neutral gray, gunship gray, etc. Nope. The radomes are different. The paint looks different depending on how long they've been flying. Maybe even the production blocks. It's all over the place. So this is one where I'm not anywhere near the type of paint Nazi that some other people are out there. Because I think with any given color, except for a very, very, very small handful, it's a range, right? It's like a ballpark. And as long as you're in that ballpark, you're good. And when I talk about ballparks, it's not just, say we're talking about grays, because there are all kinds of grays out there. It's not just like where the gray falls between white and black, right? That's part of it. It's also where it falls on the color spectrum, because you can have cool grays that are more blue, like the ghost grays that the TPS schemes are made up of, or you can have grays that are warmer, like the gold grays, or the some of the grays that are used by like the RAF. As long as you're sort of in that quadrant, I think you're generally fine. The one caveat would be if you're using decals and the decals completely vanish into the paint. Maybe pay attention to that before you paint, maybe test it before, all that kind of stuff. But as long as you're in that sort of ballpark range, I think that's totally fine. The one paint where I kind of draw a line on that a little bit is Gloss Sea Blue. Because Gloss Sea Blue is one of those colors that you see represented on models all the time as like this faded out thing. And one thing about that paint, if you go and look at reference photos from 1945 to the early 50s, all the way into like France at Dien Bien Phu flying Bearcats around, that paint didn't fade. It got dirty, it got shit on it, it got chipped, but it did not fade. And because of that, it's a pretty set color. Now there is still like a wiggle room, because it did change post-war slightly and stuff like that. But generally it's like a very dark, kind of greenish blue. It's so dark that you don't really pick up the green, but if you take it out, you notice it immediately in test mules. Yeah, like I tried painting the Hataka Gloss Sea Blue, and it looked like fucking purple. It looked like an eggplant, which is not the way the color works, because it didn't have enough green in it. Now, the one place I would throw out a caveat to this and come down on modelers for being lazy fucks is when you're going after a specific scheme of some kind, and you use a color that is technically like in the same-ish family, like, yeah, it's still green, but it's way outside of whatever quadrant ballpark you're playing in. So, for example, if you were to do, I don't know, let's talk about a Hellcat in the World War II tricolor scheme of the Pacific. So the dark sea blue, intermediate blue, and white. And instead of using those colors, you used like Blue Angels blue for the dark blue, and you used like RAF Azure for the intermediate blue, and then you used like, I don't know, light gold gray for the white. And it's one of those where it's just off enough that the entire fucking thing looks wrong. So that's one where, in my opinion, if you're going to just be that wrong, just go and make up your own scheme and do something cool with it and express yourself in a different way than trying to nail the accuracy. Because you're kind of playing this lazy-ass middle ground of like, I couldn't be bothered to get the paints right. You can't pass that off as intentional without looking like a giant asshole. So either take the time to get the right paints or learn to mix the colors right, or come up with your own cool scheme for that. Like, I'd love to see what a Hellcat would look like in a, like a modern low-vis scheme, or like, hell, do it up in a, you know, late 50s, early 60s Navy scheme with the high-vis gold, gray, and white. Like, cool, do that. Do one of the, do one of the radio drones they had after the war. All kinds of options, but that sort of like swing and a miss paint job, that's the stuff that galls me. Now, one final point I want to touch on with paint is the idea of going with your gut. A lot of times, we have a pretty good idea of what aircraft were or are painted, right? So we know that, P-47 Razorbacks were typically painted olive drab up top, neutral gray on the bottom. Pretty set in stone. We have a few cases where it's a bit more mysterious, like some aircraft in England and in Italy, particularly the ones flying off Corsica, were bare metal, and then decided they needed camouflage like holy shit. And a lot of times they went with RAF paint stocks, and so something may be labeled as olive drab, but you need to know maybe that should be like RAF dark green instead. And it's a small difference, but it's a meaningful difference. Every now and then, though, there are some where the paint scheme is literally just guesswork. It's like, well, it's something, The best example that springs to my mind, because it's fresh, are P-47Ms, particularly the ones with the, was it the 63rd Fighter Squadron, the one I did? The 61st, 2nd, and 3rd all run together to me. But it was the blue-on-blue camouflage. And there's been all kinds of debates about what these blues were. Was the dark blue really black? I don't think so. Was the lighter blue RAF Azure? That seems to be like the consensus, but honestly, having seen color photos of these things, I don't buy it for a second, because RAF Azure looks purple. It looks like lavender. And these do not look that way at all. And so, going through sort of my head, trying to figure out what are some other not like what happened, what actually was the paint. What are some plausible scenarios? What are some plausible things that it could be? And so, I figured maybe they were playing with PRU blue, the photo reconnaissance blue, that probably would have been on hand because they had some photo recon units at Boxstead where they were flying from. And Azure was a tropical paint for Africa, basically. Africa and Sicily and stuff. Why would that be at an airbase in England? I don't fuck if I know. So that was one where I basically went with my gut and it was like, I'm looking at these photos, I can see these colors, what I'm being told doesn't match with what I'm seeing, and it looks kind of stupid. So I'm going to default to that photo looks cooler than the models I see built with these colors that look stupid, so I'm going to go chase down this, and I'm going to figure out, okay, what is the plausible color range I can play with? What kind of paints would they be grabbing? PRU blue sounds good, and they would have PRU blue, they would have black, they would have white, they would probably have insignia blue to touch up insignias. That's a little range of stuff to play with, right? So I used those basically to come up with the colors for my P-47M. And that's something that I don't necessarily recommend everybody just kind of like fly off and do. I think it's one of those things where you have to have some models under your belt and a good understanding of like the period and the colors and the plausibility factors to basically stand behind your guess, for lack of a better word. But yeah, basically, accuracy in paint is a giant who the fuck knows for the most part. As long as you find your way into that sort of spectrum of acceptability, I think you're fine. Question: who wants to ruffle some feathers? Answer: AK Interactive, apparently. And possibly me too, as I respond to sort of what they did today. So earlier today, AK Interactive threw out a relatively slickly produced video teaser and a post and a few other assets promoting a new tutorial book of theirs called, I think it's called Condemnation. And the idea behind the book, at least according to their website, is things kind of suck for human rights and stuff like that around the world right now, and they wanted to, shine a light on sort of the return of human rights shittiness by depicting horrible scenes from our past as models, as art, or something. And honestly, as a concept, I don't think that is necessarily terrible. What is terrible is the execution of that concept in every single way I can imagine. So, first of all, the marketing decided to use imagery from the Holocaust. Literally like dumping bodies into mass graves to market a fucking modeling tutorial book on how to use paint. Um, they are including figures with these books. One of them is a guy shooting up drugs. Another just says Vietnamese child, and I forget the last one. I have not seen an image of what it is, but the title is something like "The Agony of Gas" or something, which doesn't sound great. And then in the book itself, they give a couple little teaser things on their website, and one of them literally shows how to paint and weather a fucking gas chamber, including like the scratches on the door of people being gassed trying to claw their way out. It's so tasteless and so wrong that I struggle to even get mad. I'm more just bewildered. Like, who would think this is a good idea? Again, I think the concept of reminding the modeling community and the painter community and whatnot, that bad shit has happened in the past and bad shit could happen again. I think that is fine. I don't think building a little diorama of a fucking gas chamber is necessarily the way to do it. I think they were probably trying to channel like that really haunting Rick Lawler diorama from a few years ago of the Jewish concentration camp prisoner having to pick up all the luggage and clothes out of one of the rail cars, which doesn't depict a fucking gas chamber. It's of the Holocaust, but it's over here. Your mind can fill in what else is happening. You don't need to, so I have a feeling they were trying to go for something like that, and that is not what they hit at all. And just a bad call all around. And all that stuff has now been deleted, but it's the internet. Screenshots happen. That's never going to get... They're going to have a hard time living this down. I will say, for a hobby that is sometimes worryingly focused on Nazis, it was at least heartening to see the massive condemnation come down for the way that AK chose to proceed with this. Yay, we're not all Nazis yet. However, I also think that the modeling community is in some ways responsible for this path that led to AK doing this. How do I mean? Well, pretty much ever since models have existed, as far as I know, but especially, as long as I've been aware of them, they are pretty much dominated by German subjects, at least in the World War II era. If you want to build ships, you can find a million kits of the Tirpitz and the Bismarck and blah, 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 blah. If you want to build aircraft, 109s, 190s, Stukas, Me-262s, all over the place. Tanks, Tigers, Panthers, Panzers, King Tigers, all kinds of paper Panzers, the Luft 46 stuff. It's, when Model Collect did this whole, like, weird 1946 walking tank mech thing, they did, like, 12 German kits and, like, one American kit. There's been this sort of footsie game with Nazis for years, not just in the kits that are produced, but also in like a lot of the way that things are marketed. So ABT 502, straight up playing on fucking German Panzers. A lot of modeling companies consciously play on German propaganda imagery and design standards or design styles to sell their stuff. It's out there. There's this long ongoing footsie thing with Nazi stuff, and I've talked about this before, where I think by itself it's sometimes a bit tasteless, but to me it's more one of those like In moderation, okay, I get it, but it's one of those that people can take and go way overboard with, and it can start to look like glorification or fetishes. Really liking the Nazis, essentially. God, I can't talk tonight. And I think basically that's kind of what has happened here. It's a little bit it's a little bit similar to the resurgence of white supremacists in the U.S., where for years there have been dog whistles and there have been playing footsie with various white supremacist stuff, and you do that over time, and all of a sudden, oh wait, there's a bunch of fucking KKK minus the hood marching around in Charlottesville chanting "Jews will not replace us." It's, I think, a similar thing happening in the modeling world with the focus on all this German stuff and German imagery and German subjects. For the most part, it might be innocuous. It might just, it might be the modeling community's equivalent of, given the conservative white folks in the suburbs a sort of, elbow in the ribs, being like, hey, how about that? But there is that subset over here who will take that shit and run with it. And I don't believe for a second that what AK is doing is throwing out their love of the Nazis, but it feels to me like they are trying to consciously tap into that sort of footsie game that's been going on. They just happen to, instead of playing footsie and rubbing a foot up a leg, they decided to go way further than that, and everybody got kind of freaked out. So to me, it all comes back to, I think it's important to acknowledge history and to certainly respect it, but at the same time, personally, I feel like we should have more of a responsibility to the subjects we create and how we depict them and how we talk about them than just German stuff looks cool. Like, that's very hollow to me. If it's not to you, then I apologize for hurting your fifis. But yeah, so the basic TLDR is AK stepped in a giant pile of shit, but at the same time, they're just walking down a path that a bunch of other companies have already walked down. Maybe they happen to veer a bit off the edge. But honestly, I'm not terribly surprised. Okay, to wrap things up on what I hope is the last Q&A and R before a cold front rolls in and knocks the temperatures back to the mid-90s, what are some kits I would like to see produced? And this is a tough one because holy shit, there are a lot that I would like to see produced. So instead of going with my usuals of like, I want a badass new 132nd P47, I want a Spod 13, etc., I decided to dig a bit deeper and come up with a bit more of an esoteric list of things that I think would be awesome to see done to a high quality standard. So by that I'm talking like, at minimum, what Academy has done with their AH-1Z, preferably something more along the lines of like, Edwards' new Mustang, Tamiya's 132nd kits, wings quality, like just blow it out of the water, kick our ass, give us something amazing. So first, I want to see a new tool, 1/32nd scale Allison engine Mustang. So the P51, P51A, A36 Apache, etc. I know that the Hobbycraft kit exists, and that's nice, but it's old and it's hard as fuck to find, and when you do find it, it's way overpriced. And honestly, I think the Allison engine Mustangs are fascinating beasts, and they played a pretty important role in the war in their own right, especially in North Africa and in the China, Burma, India theater, and I would just love to see them get a good tool up. Next, and I actually think I'll see this one probably in the next few years, I want a new Challenger 1, the wonderful British tank from the late Cold War period, the one that kicked so much ass in Desert Storm. It's always been one of my favorite tanks, and a few years ago I built the old Tamiya version and love the hell out of it. I think the thing has great lines. I kind of like that more simple tank as opposed to the ones nowadays that have all the shit hanging off of them. The various blocks and fences and stuff, just they may be effective at saving lives, but they do not interest me as a modeler at all. So fingers crossed for a new Challenger 1 to show up at some point. I know that RFM's working on a new Challenger 2, so between those and like the Chieftains from a couple years ago, I feel like we're kind of slowly moving in towards the middle to a Challenger 1. I hope. Next, I want a new tool, F4G Wild Weasel. I really don't care what scale as long as it's 1/48th or 1/32nd. The F4G has long been my favorite variant of the Phantom, probably because I was an 11-year-old when Desert Storm happened, and that's when the F4G had sort of its last big hurrah, if you will, or the Phantom in general had its last big hurrah in U.S. service. And I've always liked the lines of it. I've always liked the hill scheme on the Phantom. I've always liked the sight of it slinging harms underneath it. I tried to build the Hasegawa kit a few years ago and just ran out of steam, but rumor has it Zukimura's working on an F4G as part of their new long-nose Phantom fleet, so I think that might be one that I actually get to see. Possibly. Next, how about a badass, insane 1/48 scale space shuttle orbiter? I know that various companies have made orbiters in the past, and they've always been kind of kid-oriented, snap-tight, cheap-type things, which I'm not interested in. I want one that is, massive. I want one that looks like, the size of a bomber. I mean, something like that big. Gorgeous surface detail, open bay detail, like all the way. I would love to see that. I don't really care so much about the boosters and the fuel tanks and all that. Just I want the orbiter though. I think that'd be a really cool kit to make happen. Will it? Who knows? But I kind of feel like maybe with some of the anniversary dates of the shuttles coming up at some point in the nearest future, maybe, perhaps, I don't know. And finally, I want a 1/35th scale Apache. Where the fuck is it? I know that there's that really shitty one out there that nobody buys, except people who look at the price tag only and don't stop and think beforehand. But I'm talking like at the level that Trumpeter did their Hind, or that Academy did the Zulu Viper. Like, I want that quality. I really don't care about the variant. I would love one of the modern longbows, or one of the D Block 3s that has the upturned exhausts. But I'd be fine with an A from Desert Storm or whatnot. Like, whatever. I just want a 1/35th scale Apache. Is that so much to ask? Apparently it is. I honestly wonder if, who is it who owns the rights to it now? Boeing, I think. I wonder if they're kind of putting the brakes on it. But then again, they licensed the Mustang to Edwards, so who the fuck knows what's happening. I generally want more good, awesome helicopter kits in general, but the Apache is one that I would love to see, along with the AH-1W Super Cobra. I know that Academy/MRC did one years ago. I tried to build it, and it sucked ass. So fingers crossed we'll see that show up in a large scale as well at some point with a new tool, but I would really, really love to play around with an Apache at that size.